Now we're looking at section 6.2, which is how changes in income and price affect consumption choices. And so we see that just as we you can use utility and marginal utility to discuss making consumer choices along a budget constraint, we can also use these ideas to think about how consumer choices change when the budget constraint shifts in response to changes in income and price. That's what we're going to look at now, where there's changes of income and price. Because we can use the budget constraint framework to analyze how quantities demand did change because of price movements, the budget constraints model can illustrate the underlying logic behind demand curves. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you. So we know that income, prices, and preferences are going to affect consumer choices. Preferences kind of go along with what we were talking about in section 1, where we were talking about utility. But we know that income and how much income someone has or a business has, and then also what the prices are, we know that that's going to affect. And so we'll take a look at that. Utility and marginal utility can also be used. We can also use this to concept. And so we'll begin with a concrete example illustrating how changes of income level affect customer choices. Figure 6.3 shows a budget constraint that represents Kimberly's choice of concert tickets at $50 each and getting away overnight to a bed and breakfast for $200 a night, and applying that. Now, Kimberly, she has $1,000 that she's going to spend between these two choices, either for entertainment, either for concert tickets or to be able to get away and rest and relax at a bed and breakfast. She has $1,000 a year that she can spend between these two. Now, after thinking about her total utility and marginal utility and applying the decisions rule, that the ratio of the marginal utility to the price should be equal between the two products, Kimberly chooses point M, which is the red dashed line here. So between concert tickets between 5 and 10, and then between 0 and 5 overnight stays, what she can do. So she realizes that she can have 8 concerts and 3 overnight getaways as her utility maximizing choice. That would maximize her satisfaction. Be able to go to 8 concerts and then 3 overnight stays. Now, if the income that Kimberly has to spend, instead of only being able to spend $1,000, if she could spend $2,000 per year, that's going to cause her budget constraint to shift over to the right. And so we see that. How does this rise in income alter her utility maximizing choice? And so again, she's going to consider the utility and the marginal utility that she receives from concert tickets and overnight getaways and seek her utility maximizing choice on the new budget line. But how will her new choices relate to her original choice? And so if we were to replace the possible choices along with the new budget constraint, we're going to see that. So if we were to replace the possible choices into 3 groups with the dashed line and the horizontal lines that pass through the original choice of M in the figure divide, all choices in the upper left of the new budget constraint that are to the left of the vertical dashed line, like choice P with 2 overnight stays and 32 concert tickets, involve less of the good on the horizontal axis, but much more of the good on the vertical axis. All choices to the right of the vertical dashed line and above the horizontal dashed line, like choice N with 5 overnight getaways and 20 concert tickets, have more consumption of both goods. Finally, all choices that are to the right of the vertical dashed line but below the horizontal dashed line, like choice Q, with 4 concert tickets and 9 overnight stays, involve less of the good on the vertical axis, but more on the horizontal. So we see that. So all of these choices are theoretically possible, depending upon Kimberly's personal preferences as expressed due to the total and marginal utility that she would receive from consuming these two goods. When income rises, the most common reaction is to purchase more of both goods, which would be choice N, which is to the upper right relative to Kimberly's original choice M, although exactly how much more of each good will vary according to personal taste. Conversely, when income falls, the most typical reaction is to purchase less of both goods. As we define in this in the chapter on supply and demand, and again on the chapter on elasticity, we call goods and services normal goods when the rise in income leads to a rise in the quantity consumed of that good, and a fall in income leads to a fall in the quantity that's consumed. But however, depending on Kimberly's preference, a rise in income could cause consumption of one good to increase while the other consumption of another good would decrease. A choice like P means that a rise in income caused her increase to increase her consumption of overnight stays to decline, while a choice like Q would mean that the rise in income caused her quantity of concert tickets to decline. Goods where demand declines as income rises, or conversely, are called inferior goods. An inferior good occurs when people trim back as their income rises because they can now afford the more expensive choices that they prefer. For example, in this case, she really wants to do more overnight stays, but because of her income, if it was limited, she would not be able to do that. Not, she would rather be able then to go to more concerts. But if she had more income, she would choose to do more overnight stays. An example might be over a higher income household, they might eat fewer hamburgers and they'd be less likely to buy used cars. So they would demand more steaks and more new cars if they have a higher income. So that's just an example. So we see that the income that someone makes, the level of that, it can affect what types of products they're purchasing and in which quantities. And we see that here. So how price changes affect consumer choices. And so again, we look at Sergey's consumer choices between purchasing baseball bats and cameras. A price increase for baseball bats would have no effect on the ability to purchase cameras, but it would reduce the number of bats that Sergey could afford to buy. Thus, a price increase for baseball bats, a good on a horizontal axis, causes the budget constraint to rotate inward, as if on a hinge for the vertical axis. As in a previous section, the point M represents the original preferred point of the original budget constraint, where Sergey had chosen after contemplating his total utility and marginal and trade-offs involved between them. Okay. Okay. So we see that. And so the original utility maximizing choice is M, and as prices rise, then the budget constraint rotates clockwise. The dashed lines make it possible to see at a glance whether the new consumption choice involves less of both goods or more of the other, or less of one good and more of the other. The new possible choices would be fewer baseball bats and more cameras, as prices were to change. So after the price increase, Siegel would make a choice along the new budget constraint. Again, we can divide his choices into 3 segments by the dashed vertical and horizontal lines. In the upper left portion of the new budget constraint was his choice like H. Seagull consumes more cameras and fewer bats. If in the central portion of the new budget constraint, at a choice like J, he would consume less of both goods. At the right-hand end, as a choice like L, he consumes more bats but fewer cameras. The typical response to higher prices is that a person chooses to consume less of the product that has the higher price. This occurs for two reasons, and both reasons can occur simultaneously. The substitution effect occurs when the price changes and consumers have an incentive to consume less of the good with a relatively higher price and more of goods with relatively lower price. The income effect is that a higher price means, in effect, the buying power of income has been reduced, even though actual income has not changed, which leads to buying less of the good when the good is normal. In this example, the higher price of baseball bats would cause Sergey to buy less bats for both reasons. Exactly how much will the higher price of bats cause Sergey's bat consumption to fail? Figure 6.4 suggests a range of possibilities. Sergey may react to the higher price of baseball bats by purchasing the same quantity of bats or cutting his camera consumption. This choice is the point K on new budget constraint, straight below the original choice M. Alternatively, Sergey might react by dramatically reducing his bat purchases and purchasing more cameras. The key is that it would be prudent to assume that a change in price of one good would only affect the consumption of that good. For example, since Sergey's purchases all of his products out of the same budget, a change in the price of baseball bats would also have a range of effects, either positive or negative, on his purchase of cameras. Since Sergey purchases all of his products out of the same budget, a change in the price of one good can also have a range of effects, either positive or negative, on what is being consumed of other goods. And we see that. And we see that because we know, families, they have to make decisions, right? If the price of fuel is going up, then they're going to have to decide, obviously, then out of that, they only have so much of a budget of, what they can spend after they pay their bills, then that's going to change. Then what they spend on food, what they're spending on other things, they're going to have to consider the totality of that. Because, if they're having to pay more on gas, then they're having to maybe not eat out as much so that they have the money then for that, making a change there. So the foundation of demand curves. Now, changes in price of a good lead to budget constraints to rotate. A rotation in the budget constraint means that when individuals are seeking their highest utility, the quantity that is demanded of that good will change. In this way, the logical foundation of demand curves, which show a connection between prices and quantity demanded, are based on the underlying idea of individuals seeking utility, which is figure 6.5, shows a budget constraint with a choice between housing and everything else. On the vertical axis, constraint with a choice between housing and everything else. Putting everything else on the vertical axis can be a useful approach in some cases, especially when the focus of analysis is on one particular good. We label the preferred choice on the original budget constraint that provides the highest possible utility, MO, M0. The other three budget constraints represent successively higher prices for housing, which is P1, P2, and P3. As the budget constraints rotates in and in again, we label the utility maximizing choices M1, M2, and M3, and the quantity demanded of housing falls from Q0 to Q1 to Q2 and Q3. And we see that. And so thus, as the price of housing rises, then the budget constraint rotates clockwise and the quantity consumed of housing falls. Certus paribus means with all other things being the same. We graph this relationship, the price of housing rising from P0 to P1 to P2 and P3, while the total quantity of housing demanded falls from Q0 to Q1 to Q2 to Q3 on a demand curve, which is on part B of the figure that we see on the screen. The vertical dashed lines stretching between the top and bottom of figure 6.5 show that the quantity of housing demanded for each point is the same in both A and B. We ultimately determine the shape of a demand curve by the underlying choices that maximizing utility subject to a budget constraint. While economists may not be able to measure utils, they can certainly measure price and quantity demanded. So we can look at price and quantity demanded, but we see how that is. Obviously, the higher the price is for housing, then the less people are going to be able to purchase it. And in looking again at how this applies to government and business, and I'm going to stop the share for now because I don't have anything to show for this. So the budget constraint framework for making utility maximizing choices offers a reminder that people can react to a change in price and income in a range of different ways. For example, in the winter months of 2005, costs for heating homes increased significantly in many parts of the country as prices of natural gas and electricity soared, again, in large part due to what happened with Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. And so people, tried to figure out, okay, what could they do? So they reacted because of the price of energy went up, then it reduced the quantity demand of energy. So example, people turned down their thermostats in their homes. They started wearing heavier sweaters inside in order to keep their heat down in order to be able to still stay warm and to manage their bill. Now, even so, many home heating bills rose, so people adjusted their consumption in other ways. As we learned in the chapter on elasticity, the short-run demand for home heating is generally inelastic. Each home cuts back on what is valued least in the margin. For some, it could be dinners out, it could be vacation, or proposed buying a new refrigerator or new car. Sharply higher energy prices can have effects beyond the energy market, including a widespread reduction of purchasing throughout the rest of the economy, because people are trying to figure out, obviously, there are some people that they cannot adjust their thermostat. So maybe somebody has a medical condition, or maybe they're epileptic, where if they get too hot or too cold, it's going to cause them to go into a seizure. So they're going to keep their thermostat the same. It's going to cost them a lot. If it's in the summer, they're having to still run the air because they have to keep their home cool. Or in the winter, they have to still run the heat because they need to keep their home warm. And regardless of the fact that, yes, it's going to cost them more, but then they're going to have to cut back in other ways. Maybe it's eating out. Maybe it's doing other things that they might. Maybe it's not buying a new video game. They really want to buy a new video game. Well, maybe they can't do that because they need that money to pay their PG&E. But they realize yes, it's going to cost more, but they can't reduce their use. So they're going to find some other way to cope with that. And we see this dealing with the government and how the government imposes taxes on a lot of products, such as gasoline, cigarettes, and alcohol. And that's one of the reasons why those things are so highly taxed, is because the government's trying to regulate how much of those goods are being consumed, particularly with cigarettes and alcohol, and to an extent also gasoline. And so we see that the higher prices of alcohol causes the budget constraint to pivot left, and alcoholic beverage consumption to likely to decrease. Because again, if it costs more for alcohol, people aren't going to, do it. The same thing with cigarettes. Now to buy cigarettes, it's very, very, very expensive. And so a lot of people, they've quit and they made a decision, you know what, I want to quit. Yes, there's a lot of health reasons as to why it's best to quit, but also they quit because the cost is just so high because the taxes, they keep taxing it higher and higher. And so people decide, you know what, it's not worth it to me. It doesn't draw the same satisfaction that it did. I would rather have that money for other things. And so I'm going to I'm going to quit. And we see that, uh, for example, and again, if, however, people may also react to the higher prices in alcoholic beverages by cutting back on other purchases. So they may still want their alcohol if they go out to eat. So instead of, they're going to buy their alcohol, but instead they're going to cut down on buying all of the appetizers, the chicken wings and the nachos and all the apps. They're going to cut down on that, because they prioritize that they still want to have their drink. It would be unwise to assume that the liquor industry is the only one affected by a tax on alcoholic beverages. And so we see that. And there's a thing in here about that. And then again, looking at that and how that works. The interaction between prices and budget constraints and personal preferences determine household choices. The flexibility and powerful terminology of utility maximizing gives economists a vocabulary for which these elements bring these elements together. So not even economists believe that people walk around mumbling about their marginal utilities before they walk into a shopping mall, accept a job, or make a deposit into a savings account. However, economists do believe that individuals seek their own satisfaction or utility, and that people often decide to try a little less of one thing and a little more of something else that they want. If we accept these assumptions, then the idea of utility maximizing households facing budget constraints becomes highly plausible. We know that people are going to they're going to figure out what's going to make them the most happy, what's going to give them the most utility. And so there's a section in here called Clear It Up. So does who controls household income make a difference? And so in the mid 1970s, the United Kingdom made an interesting policy change to its child allowance policy. This program provides a fixed amount of money per child to each family, regardless of family income. So the family, they get paid a certain amount for each child that they have. Traditionally, the program provides a fixed amount of money per child. Traditionally, the child allowance had been distributed to families by withholding less in taxes from their paycheck of the family wage earner, typically the father, in this time period. The new policy instead provided a child allowance as a cash payment to the mother. As a result of the change, households have the same level of income and face the same prices in the market, but the money is more likely to be in the mother's purse than in the father's wallet. Should this change in policy alter household consumption patterns? Basic models of consumption decisions of the sort that we examine in this chapter assume that it doesn't matter which parent or guardian receives the money, because both are going to seek to maximize the family's utility as a whole. In effect, this model assumes that everyone in the family has the same makeup and has the same preferences. There has not been extensive research on diverse family structures and guardian parent sex and gender related to spending. However, the older research on families with one man and one woman parent indicate that gender does affect decisions. When the mother controls a larger share of the family's income, a number of studies in the United Kingdom and in a wide variety of other countries have found that the family tends to spend more on restaurant meals, childcare, and women's clothing, and less on alcohol and tobacco. As the mother controls a larger share of household income, children's health improves too. These findings suggest that when providing assistance to families in high income countries and low income countries alike, the monetary amount of assistance is not all that matters. It also matters who in the family actually receives the money. Yeah, we see that there's a lot of factors that go into this and into what people are buying and how that works. And that kind of leads us into the next section.